acompañarnos de parte de ZsONAMACO y en especial de la sección de nuevas propuestas. Les agradecemos por estar aquí. El día de hoy tenemos un lujo. Vamos a estar platicando con Tom Burr. Desafortunadamente esta conversación va a tener que ser en inglés y no tenemos traducción, pero por favor, si alguien en algún momento quiere interrumpir, siéntanse libre para aclarar cualquier cosa. So I'm going to switch to English now. I'm going to read a small introduction. Tom Burr is an American artist that lives and works in New York. He was born in New Haven, Connecticut in 1963. He attended the Educational Center for the Arts High School, and after that he went to the School of Visual Arts in 1986. After that, he went to the Whitney Independent Study Program in 1987. And since 1988 up to date, he has shown his work extensively in the United States and in Europe. His work is part of important collections in Italy, Germany, Israel, Switzerland, France, Lebanon, among others. He has recently published an anthology of his writings from 1991 to 2015 with the FRAC Champagne Ardenne in France, in collaboration with Sternberg Press. So let's give it an applause to Mr. Tom Burr.
Thank you.
I would like to start this conversation with you telling us about your upbringing and your first encounters with art.
Okay. Well, I did grow up in New Haven, and I think some of my very first... can everybody hear me? Is this working properly? My first experiences with art were in the late 1960s, early 70s in relationship to pop art and minimalist art that I would find on the campus of Yale University, which was near where I grew up. So that had a very formative experience, was a very formative experience for me. And then Humberto just mentioned that I went to this sort of alternative arts high school in New Haven, and it was taught by Yale grad students from the art program. So I missed a sort of traditional art education and sort of jumped right into post-minimalism, which is sort of where I stayed. So that was sort of the trajectory that brought me to where I am.
And after that, you went to the Whitney Independent Program, right?
Yeah, I came to New York and I went to School of Visual Arts and studied alongside my friends such as Elizabeth Payton, Mark Dion, Andrea Fraser, and we're all remain friends now. And I went to the Whitney Independent Study Program, the ISP, directly after that in 1987. And it was an amazing time because people like Craig Owens or Benjamin Buchloh, Yvonne Rayner, Barbara Kruger, these were all my instructors at the time. So it was a very, very fruitful period coming out of the pictures generation era into a kind of heavy milieu of feminist theory, appropriationist ideas at the time.
Can you describe what was to be an artist in the late 80s in New York by this time?
Can I remember? The context that I was in was one that was framed very much by theoretical discourse, I would say. Mm-hmm. So I had a very hard time at School of Visual Arts for a while because it was heavily involved in ideas of production, and it wasn't until I encountered certain theoretical frameworks, particularly through the teachings of and writings of Craig Owens and the friendship of Craig Owens, a critic who was an editor of Art in America, who's also a brilliant man, who's no longer alive. But he had a huge impact on myself, also on Andrea and Mark, Greg Bordowitz. And so this kind of context at that time was what sort of, I sometimes wonder if I'd be able to enter an art world that is today in the same manner. I have my doubts about that. I wonder if I would be as confident because I think it's much more daunting, the market, in terms of what it's become. I remember at that time in 1987, I think it was, when Barbara Kruger and Sherry Levine entered the Mary Boone Gallery, and we were all aghast. You know, we thought this was the most commercial step that one could make, and now I think it simply seems charming in retrospect. Of course, there was a political dimension to their being taken on by a gallery like that as well, that had to do with their role as women artists and a sort of position with access to power. But yeah, it was an entirely different context at the time. I was also fortunate enough to work with a gallery called American Fine Arts Company that was directed by and owned by a man named Colin DeLand.
I know that it was in the Whitney program that you met Colin, right?
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, I knew of the gallery. It was a kind of a sleepy gallery on the east side in the East Village, and then he had moved to Worcester Street. And when I did my final thesis show, let's say studio show, at the end of the program, Colin came to the studio, and that's where I first met him, and that's when we started a dialogue that resulted in our working together.
And how were those first years with American Fine Arts?
You know, complicated, I would say. At that time, in the late 80s, I think things were quite stratified in terms of this is an era that is just preceding a notion of quote-unquote identity politics, right? So there were different camps that were sort of delineated around those notions. And it was also a time when there was quite a lot of homophobia in the art world. And so Colin participated in this as well. And we had very frank conversations about that, but very much in relationship to what would the audience, quote-unquote audience, be for my work. But then so many of my colleagues, Andrea, Mark, Christian Philip Muller, etc., were taken on by the gallery in a more serious way before I was. And Colin and I had something of a sort of strange, over a few years, kind of courtship in some sense before I was represented by the gallery. So it was a bit complex. But I think that evolution took place at that point by my entering the gallery and also by Colin's personal affiliation with Pat Hearn and Pat Hearn's politics, which were much more related to what would become queer politics.
So by that time, American Fine Arts had a very particular role within the New York environment, and Colin had a very specific position where he thought his gallery should have a mission in the broader environment in New York City.
Right. I think that's fair to say. It was I think it was somewhere around it was in the late 80s that Colin really hit largely with a group of artists like Jessica Stockholder, Katie Nolan, Jessica Diamond, Peter Fend, and then it was a couple of years later that kind of morphed into his concern with something that loosely defined as institutional critique, and many of us were interested in redefining what that meant. I think, unfortunately, right now sometimes it gets flattened out again. But we were all very interested in expanding the terms of what that could possibly be, expanding the terms of what an institution meant, and starting to think about ourselves as part of the institution. And Colin very much participated in that dialogue. And I think he did have a mission, but he also had a very dramatic persona. He was very much of a performer. He also had a part of his educational mission was he which was quite comical. He had a course that he would run for collectors, right? And it would start with, let's say, Duchamp, and it would end with his artists. The trajectory was that specific. So the mission was twofold. Of course, there were sales to be considered, but it was also Colin was a philosopher at heart. So
can you differentiate what was part of Colin's persona and what was like the other, like, more hidden part?
No, I don't think so, really. I think they were quite integrated. Colin was quite naturally a performer, but there was also something quite earnest in it. There was no bullshit to it, really. Colin was an incredibly inclusive, generous person. He was just also quite eccentric, and I would say eccentric personally, but also perhaps as a business model. He was not. I think it was with great reluctance that he became centered within the art world, because he did prefer to be eccentric and somewhat operating in the margins, but the art world adored him, and also his wife Pat Hearn. So they became sort of dead center in terms of the operations that were occurring then. But his personality was quite elastic in a sense, and that he could, on the one hand, be the person that resisted sales entirely if he didn't approve of the collection. I mean, everybody does that to a degree, but he would do that with very young artists who, in fact, needed these situations to occur. So there was a bit of a masochistic tendency in a certain way, I would say, a fear of success that I think was shared by, but coming from a kind of critical position.
And in a way, Colin kind of like achieved something that for many galleries is a hard point, which is to bend over towards the commercial side or to the more critical or theoretical side of a gallery. He was kind of like very in between those points, I think.
Yeah, I think he was, and I'm glad you brought those 2 points up, because I do think the legacy right now, or let's say the mythology, which is very strong, certainly in the New York art world, and also I would say Cologne, Germany, and also in Austria. These were points that were very affected by Colin's activities. But Colin also was very strategic and was also interested in what it meant to be operating within the commercial system. Colin is responsible for starting the Armory Art Fair, along with several other dealers, but that part is often edited out. I think now there's a kind of purification that people want Colin to be.
And he was also a big part of the Con Fair, right?
Yes, that's right. That's absolutely right. So I think that complexity interests me as well about him, and that the fact that Colin was actually very much a philosopher. So I think sometimes people try to typify or to sort of portray Colin as being a frustrated artist, but I don't think that fits into his mold at all. Although he did also have this ulterior career as an artist. I mean, but that was also sort of a performance under the pseudonym of John Dog and J. St. Bernard. So that was another one of his activities that sort of fed back into the mythology of the gallery.
Yeah, I'm glad that you bring up this kind of like mythology, or because I'm very interested in how people now like mystify Colin's figures, thinking that he was kind of like in a higher moral ground because he kind of like resisted the commercial or the market ambience.
Right. I'd say he did at times, but it was but what was extraordinary was the contradictions. Mm-hmm. He very much wanted his particular group of artists to succeed, but on his own terms. I think that he also alienated himself in the moment very much because of some of these positions. And it was not simply the positions taken, but the way he would present it. He was a very dogmatic about being very literate. He would write very long, he didn't have a quick, easy sales pitch. He would write volumes of verse in that sense. But he was an extraordinary figure. I don't mean to sort of belittle him, but there's a lot of mythology now about him that I think serves a purpose now. People are looking for an idealized moment. It was just as conflicted and just as embedded in market conditions as the current moment.
And also, I think this mythology about American fine arts has to do with the community, the type of community that Colin constructed. Because right now you can see that in books, like, these kind of like pictures that are distributed about American fine arts and how it was like a very cohesive community that actually grew together.
I think that's true. There were, in fact, a few communities within it. There was the group that I was a part of that came from people that I went to school with, and I guess I already mentioned those people. There was that earlier phase that included people like Katie, but that got phased out, and Colin really turned his back on that moment at a certain point, or those artists left. Yeah. Katie Nolan left for Paula Cooper, and Jessica Stockholder left for Jay Gorney. But then there was another wrinkle that occurred later that I think is more akin to Colin's sense of theatricality, but also in relationship perhaps to pop art strategies. And that has to do with John Waters entering the gallery, and also Art Club 2000, which was a group of young students who were at the Cooper Union at the time and interning. At least a couple of them were interning at American Fine Arts Company, and Colin was the cohesive figure behind Art Club 2000 becoming an organization, becoming an art group as an organization. And those were as much a part of his activities as well. So that Art Club 2000, I think, was very influential in terms of creating the cult of youth around American Fine Arts Company. The group of young people that I was around, we were much more sort of intellectual nerds and theory nerds, and the Cooper Union kids were much more facile in mixing fashion and pleasure with a theoretical model. So I think that sort of opened the doors to some of this mythology as well.
Can we talk about your show 42nd Street Structures?
Yes, we can.
1995.
42nd Street Structures in 1995 was my second show at American Fine Arts Company, and the year is it was a show that was contextualized by what was occurring around Times Square at that exact moment. Mayor Giuliani had just passed an ordinance that essentially criminalized and outlawed any ability for the sex industry to function. I don't remember the exact terms, but it was something like no sex shop, which included theaters and peep shows and magazine stores, could operate within, let's say it was 100 feet of another one, a church, a school, and some other thing. So essentially wiping them out. This was the nail in the coffin. This is something that had been going on for decades through various civic groups. But what was very particular about it was that it was couched in moral terms. It was couched in the betterment of the community, in the name of family values. And so there was a morality to it, when in fact it was about privatization and it was about corporate money moving in. It was a neoliberal muscle being flexed. This exhibition occurred simultaneous with this occurring. I wanted this to be an exhibition that captured that flux, that captured that decay and that transformation that was occurring. So it was a group of very pared down structures that were all based on the very generic types of spaces and structures and rooms and passages that were in these spaces that were in the process of being disappeared.
And some 2 years before that, in 1993, you did this project, An American Garden, and you referred to it as an informational non-site. Can you explain that concept?
Yeah, this is, I would say this piece is sort of the culmination of a body of work that I was doing that was directly coming out of Robert Smithson, but more specifically coming out of Robert Smithson's final text that he wrote before he died, called Frederick Law Olmsted and the Dialectical Landscape. And in this, I was very interested in the notion of the generic landscape as an earthwork, and I was interested in Smithson's thinking to a certain degree, but I was interested in advancing it and starting to talk about a discursive site, more specifically, discursive public, and the notion of plurality in relationship to audience and publics. So I wrote a text at this time that was based on the text that Smithson had wrote, and I made this piece in 1993 for this exhibition Zonsbeek in Arnhem in the Netherlands. And I wanted to, I thought about this more recently with this exhibition that I did at Bortolami that perhaps we're going to be talking about in a bit, where I revisited some of these pieces as well as did new work. But I at the time, and I still feel this way, I wanted to make work, I wanted to make sculptural work, I wanted to make architectural work, whatever modifier you want to use there, that was discursive, that operated like a text on a certain level, that gets read, which opens itself up to ideas of multiple angles and interpretations, which isn't the same thing as saying that it can mean anything you want it to mean. It just means that it's multifaceted and complex in terms of its makeup. I don't know if that answers.
Yeah. And I'm very interested about the relationship between 42nd Street Structures and this, because beyond the reference to Smithson, this also has to do with the notion of visibility and opacity that often comes out in your work.
That's right. I should have. That's a very important layer of these projects that were the sort of I refer to as the park projects now, all occurring in the late '80s into the early '90s. And when I talk about this notion of multiple audiences and multiple publics, I was dealing with the notion of sexualities. I was dealing with the notion of gender differentiation. I was dealing with the notion of homosexuality at the time. This is at a moment when an awful lot of work was being done around the AIDS epidemic, and it was at a moment when you had to sort of make a certain kind of decision. I had to make a certain kind of decision, which was critical to developing what I wanted to do, to talk about sexuality, to talk about gay sexuality, what would become the notion of very soon we refer to as queer. Necessarily meant using imagery at that time. It necessarily meant engaging in the pictorial. And that had everything to do with coming out of the pictures generation and coming out of a certain kind of feminist politic of the image. But it also had to do with the urgency surrounding the AIDS crisis and a sort of direct action, let's say, a sort of instrumentalization of artwork that had to happen, which was extremely important. But I wanted to do something different, and I felt that I wanted to talk less about homosexual desire, let's say, to use a very accessible term, and I wanted to talk more about homophobia. I wanted to talk more about the structures of viewing that created compartmentalizations, alienations, and separations.
And I think that's a very nice connection to this next work.
Oh, let me just say one. I'm sorry. I think to your point, Humberto, I think one thing that was important about this piece, because this is a recreation of a part of Central Park called the Ramble. So it's not just any part of Central Park. It's the park part of the park that interested me for a couple of reasons converging. The first was that Olmsted designed this part of the park to be the most naturalistic part of the park, although it was a completely manufactured notion of nature. It was entirely artificially created. And very early on, it became something of a lover's lane because it didn't have the open parkscapes that other parts of Central Park did. It had intricate private spaces. And then out of this quote-unquote lover's lane in the 19th century, it became used by gay men for cruising and bird watchers. And the two constituencies would occupy the space simultaneously. So that's an important element to know about this particular
and
project.
also that, I mean, I think that has a very important relationship with desire, because it kind of like fluctuates between like a natural strand of desire versus a more instrumentalized or artificial way of perceiving desire within the public space.
I think that's true. I was also, relative to that comment, I was very interested in urban planning. I was very interested in landscape design at this time, and I was very interested in this term used in landscape design in English called desire lines. And desire lines are when there are constructed paths, paved paths, etc. And when someone decides to cut a path across a lawn that was not designed, that's called a desire line. And it has all sorts of interesting implications, of course.
As I was saying, I think that this has a very strong relationship with this next project that's called Unearthing the Public Restrooms, that also deals with visibility and with the betterment of population and with like cleanness and with the citizens and with public wealth.
It's not dissimilar from the 42nd Street conundrum that I was dealing with, where these are all public restrooms on the island of Manhattan in New York that had all been closed. This is in the early 90s, and these images evolved out of an essay that I had worked on as an artwork, let's say, that was published in a magazine called Documents in the early 90s. And in it, I had taken different voices from the mid-1900s to the 1950s that constructed a social history of the public restroom in terms of hygiene, issues of class differentiation, issues of sexuality, issues of homosexuality, and then ultimately issues of political framing and neoliberalism, again, coming in to sort of privatize spaces and the erosion of the notion of a public space in New York.
But also, aside of this whole conceptual cloud of ontological issues or problems, there's something very important about the physical shape and the formal aspects of these constructions.
Do you mean these constructions in my work?
Yeah.
Yeah. I've always been very interested. This is something I think I learned. One of the tools that I learned is somebody like Sherry Levine, let's say. I come out of a period of time that was heavily involved in the notion of appropriation. I worked for many years with an foreign artist named Dara Birnbaum. And I thought very much about the notion of occupying already existing structures, the image as a ready-made in a way, and also not taking up the sort of naturalized position of inventing something myself. So in a work like this, obviously and on some level I'm thinking about repeating Dan Graham or repeating Bernard Hillebecker. And playing with the notion of documentary photography and that kind of truth, access to truth that this kind of photography sort of implies. At the same time, I'm very interested in and where images and photography slips in and out of physicality and nods towards a legacy of minimalism.
I wouldn't say it's just a plain repetition, because you're actually talking about the physical limits and how space constrains bodies in this kind of like these positives of betterment, but also you're talking about the politics of what's happening within this space.
I am, and that's something that was also a big component of the 42nd Street Structures show, and also continues, I would say, into my work now. I've always been very interested in the division of space, architectural space, in terms of how it frames bodies, positions bodies, allows bodies to be looked at, not looked at, controlled. I'm very interested in spaces that position people as separate next to other people who are separate, next to other people who are separate, like video booths, like stalls, like compartmentalized rooms in a hospital, this sort of thing, where people are sort of isolated within a group context.
And following this very interesting strand about isolation and separation, I think that the peak of this notion in your work comes with Deep Purple.
Deep Purple, yes. So Deep Purple, 2000, is a piece that I made for an exhibition that I had, a survey exhibition of my work at Braunschweig, Germany, at the Kunstverein, which is this Palladian villa, and inside, a very small Palladian villa, and inside there were existing works of mine, and outside in the garden, I created this piece. This is not, this is a later shot from the Fraction Pen Ardennes in France. And Deep Purple was generated out of a sculpture by Richard Serra called Tilted Arc, which I'm sure that most people know is probably the most famous incidence of most notorious public sculpture. 1980 or 81, his Corten steel structure goes up at Federal Plaza in New York City, met with immediate controversy. Very famous court case that went on. Many artists spoke, and ultimately it came down in 1989, and it actually still exists, not according to Sarah's definition, but in terms of materiality, as it was chopped into 3 different sections, and it's in a garbage heap somewhere in Maryland or something. I wanted to create a version of this. I wanted to quote it. I wanted to walk next to it in some way. I wanted to impersonate it. But I did it. I wanted mine to be much more fragile. I wanted mine to be vulnerable. I wanted mine to be 2/3 the scale of his. So if his was 120 feet long, mine was 80 feet long. It has the exact same curve and the same proportions. I worked with an architect to guarantee that. But it's made out of wood rather than steel, and it was painted a very deep purple color. Yeah.
Arbitrary or
the color?
Yeah.
The color
and the title.
And the title. The title followed the color. I was thinking an awful lot. It was going to be outside in this natural environment by a hedge, and there was a parkland behind it. I was thinking a lot about Serra's notions of authenticity, Serra's notions of that his work is not decorative, which I disagree with. Well, I disagree with the notion of the decorative as being a derogatory term, let's say, and not being a political term. And I was also interested in the fact that perhaps the color purple, I wanted a color that seemed to be highly artificial, that couldn't fall into the realm of any of the quote-unquote natural colors. And I wanted it to have a sort of sense of decor to it, almost interior.
I'm wondering what happened in these two sections that the wall actually created. What would you say that happened with this division in space? Was it only visual? Did you were actually dividing something like kind of like dynamic within the building?
You mean with Deep Purple?
Yeah.
Yeah. The first, I was very interested in how Deep Purple divides the space, and that was generated very much out of how Richard Serra's pieces divide the space. I mean, I think that the typical language when one's talking about a Serra is one of awe, inspiration, right? And when there's kind of rather inarticulate gestures of encountering the sublime, let's say. I was interested in the more social and political and idiosyncratic context that I used to find his sculptures in. For instance, Carnegie, this piece that he made, named for Andrew Carnegie, outside the Pittsburgh Museum, the Carnegie Museum of Art, rather, sorry. Inside, you would always find needles from junkies, you'd find cigarette butts, you'd find napkins, you'd find condoms. These spaces contained areas of protection, let's say, to a certain degree. This is what happened at Federal Plaza. It was denied by the authorities that wanted to take Tilted Arc down. They said it was simply that it was an eyesore, and that it was also a pre-terrorist moment. They said that it could possibly harbor terrorist possibilities behind the guard. So with Deep Purple, what I wanted it to do was be defiantly mobile, defiantly able to reinterpret its location, because Serra's definition of site specificity meant that if the work were to be moved, it was eradicated, that its meaning was lost. I wanted to counter that with something much more promiscuous and opportunistic, which is to say that it would move to very different sites. And Deep Purple has been in many different sites, and I've often and each time I've considered how it's dividing the space, how it's creating this notion, as all screens do, necessarily of an inside and an outside, of an inclusion and an exclusion.
Yeah, I'm very interested in this idea of dividing and overlapping, because this is something that kind of like appears later on in your collage work.
Yes.
And not only as a formal strategy, but also as a conceptual strategy. And that's kind of what happened in your last show at Bortolami, where you kind of like overlap different temporalities, kind of like revised previous work, and also showed a new body of work.
Humberto is referring to this exhibition that just closed a bit ago at my gallery that I work with in New York called Bortolami. And in this, I did an exhibition that kind of evolved over time. It was going to be simply a project that was going to coincide with the publication of my book of writings. I wanted an exhibition to contextualize the book, and I wanted that to occur in the opposite way as well. So
You're covering the antenna. Just grab from.
hold it a little higher. All right. So there was a combination of new and old work there. And that's why I called the exhibition Circa. And I wanted that new and old work to kind of reflect the span of the writings. And I wanted the book to be considered an object, and I wanted the exhibition to be considered a text, and to sort of slip those two things one onto the other and back and forth. So the first room that you entered, there's the first room. That's a piece called Circa 77, which was one of these pieces that I was referring to as these park pieces, and it was very closely related to the work in American Garden that we were looking at earlier that was outside. This piece happened 2 years later in 1995 at the Kunsthalle in Zurich, and was part of an exhibition of 3 artists that were all thinking about the idea of this park in Zurich called the Platzspitz, which had also been undergoing a similar kind of neoliberal cleanup, not dissimilar from what was occurring in New York that I had been commenting and thinking about. And, you know, it was very important to me that this park space was a displacement, that it came into an interior space like a white cube like this. This is the third time this had been shown. And therefore, and it needed to have a certain height so that it cuts bodies off at a certain point and alienates people and positions people, not out of some sort of sadistic tendency on my part, but as a way of making a hyper-conscious, hypersensitive viewing situation where ultimately the audience becomes the subject of the work.
And also, these elements that you were talking about a minute ago, in Deep Purple, these kind of like needles and cigarettes and kind of like trash, are the same elements that appeared here.
That's right. This was I considered this, and at certain times with my work, I want to slip between what I call a kind of hyperrealism, or kind of, I suppose that would be in quotes, and it's something much more abstract and something more. I always refer to it as in terms of modalities of speech. Sometimes they're incredibly chatty and verbal. Other times it's things are unspoken, and I want these things to oscillate. This piece would be one of the ones I would suppose that is a bit more chatty, and so there's a lot of detail in it. But there's a temporal aspect to it and a falseness to it. Falseness is built into it. It was this piece was done in 1995 about what the park might have looked like in 1977. So it's a fantasy in a certain sense. So I picked up debris. And in 1977, this park was also used for light drugs, alcoholics, people just hanging out who didn't want to be home, gay cruising, light criminality, let's say, as defined. In 1995, it was completely cleaned up and reorchestrated. The plants were cut down for greater visibility. So I collected this debris in 1995, debris that would impersonate debris from 1977. And what was quite nice about mounting this piece again is that the time span tripped again. So it was made in 1995, about 1977, then 20 years later installed for the first time in the United States in this exhibition, Circa. And in a sense, Circa also comes from the name of this piece, which is Circa 77. And I wrote a text alongside this called Trash that dealt with these issues that I'm talking about of the sort of neoliberal moment, and also this sort of homosexual or homosocial desire, but also morphed and blended with Andy Warhol's film Trash as well. So there was this element there too.
I think that this piece actually creates a distance with the viewers. It kind of like looks as a display that it's not available to enter. But also, I think that you're making a commentary. You're highlighting the possibilities and impossibilities of public space. But I'm wondering if this kind of commentary is very academic in a way. It's very thoughtful. I'm wondering if you could tell me, what is your idea that this public space should be? Or what kind of claim is it that you're doing? What would be your wish or your desire for this public space to be?
You know, I think about that. But you know, I rarely find myself wanting to directly comment on that in a certain way, and I'll tell you why. I think that for the work to operate as this mirror, which is what I've often wanted my work. I mean, my work obviously includes mirrors oftentimes, and I always find that quite kind of comical because I am wanting my pieces to be mirrors of existing situations, somewhat warped and made strange perhaps in a sort of almost Brechtian way. But I don't know that I have a formula of how I would want it to be differently. For instance, I very much understand and accept on a certain level the confines that I find myself in as a subject, or as a loosely defined subject. I don't necessarily take a position of what a utopian place might be.
So in a way, just opening this zone of opacity and of kind of like confusion or indeterminacy kind of like solves it.
I don't know, yeah, perhaps, I don't know if it solves it. For me, it satisfies my desire to create something that is, this is a sort of old-fashioned word, but creates a kind of criticality. And I don't mean that in terms of the voice of the critic. I don't mean this at all. I mean something that is aware of itself, hyper-aware, objects that are very aware of where they are. I'm very interested in I'm very interested in the history of, for instance, of sculpture, and how sculpture always wants to disconnect itself from sight and wants to disconnect itself from context. So I've always decided that contextual work, whether you want to call it architecture or objects or sculpture, is really important to me. But contextual things, I think, is one way of working through the various confines and parameters that we find ourselves defined by.
And talking about context and sight, the project that was just in the next room, Grids, was precisely talking about that.
So, for this exhibition, this was a bit of a daunting task because on the one hand, that one room had works from the mid-90s, I would say the early to mid-90s. Maybe one work was from 98. Then there was a slight passage between the two rooms and you ended up in 2016. So I had to somehow make an exhibition that would function and do the kinds of things I wanted it to do with 20 years being extracted from it in a sense, right? This wasn't a museum survey where everything that I had done had been acknowledged and accounted for. So I wanted to do work that had everything to do with the fact that just around the corner was this older work. And this older work had everything to do with urban context and the things that we've been talking about. The new work, one example, in 1995, with the 42nd Street Structures project, I walked around with a Polaroid camera and took a lot of research photographs that made themselves their way into the work to a certain degree, a peripheral way. It was a loud object. It was a very obvious object, a very conspicuous object, rather. I felt very strongly that in the 90s, if we were dealing with the issue of surveillance, by 2016, we had absorbed that idea. We were bodies that know how to surveil ourselves, and that seems to be a much more urgent issue to me. I'm also aware that's a fairly privileged thing to say because actual surveillance still does terrorize communities and bodies, but we've also absorbed it. We've learned it. So I was interested in creating a very flattened architectural space, a very flattened urban space. The notion of something that could perhaps be nodding towards some sort of discursive spaces as well, and very much talking about the desire to find me, the artist, somewhere in the work, to make some sort of logic out of that search.
And also this new work was incorporating kind of like the technology of the time. You use your phone to do some of the pictures here.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a pretty zero-degree technological person. I very much like to use the most available extension of my body that's possible. And so the iPhone. I mean, I was interested in this idea, for instance, that many of us, and this is a curious phenomenon that I think talks quite a bit about our relationship to surfaces, architectural surfaces, our own bodies. We often can be perhaps at a dinner or a group situation, and one removes oneself to go to the bathroom, and one finds a reflective surface. And this is a known trope at this point. This is a function that we perform. This is something that would have been, rather alien 20 years ago in the same way, with the same prevalence. But that also goes hand in hand with the notion of the skin of a building. There was a brief moment, and I think it was called postmodernism, where different materiality was started to enter into the discourse and the fabrication of buildings after the international style. Things mutated into stone, into surfaces. It seems to me that most building that's occurring internationally, certainly in New York and in Europe, has gone back to the reflective surface, has gone back to the mirror. And I think that's not coincidental. I don't think that's without significance. That the privatization that's occurring, the alienation that is intended to generate, and keeping certain things inside and exporting certain things to the outside, perhaps, is a phenomenon that interested me in this work.
And also something that interests me is that, if I'm not wrong, this series feature for the first time kind of like hints of your own body, right?
That's true. I think with most of my work, I don't really sketch very much. I tend to write to make work, and I write and I write and I write and I write, and then things get edited and reduced and reduced and reduced. So with this work, I was looking at a lot of people. I was looking at a lot of early feminist work. I was looking at John Copland's. I was working at a lot of people that had used their body in their works. That got drastically reduced from my original ideas to just the bare traces of myself, often very self-consciously fetishistic edges of my body, specifically clothed parts of my body. I've used my shoes before, and I'm interested in where a body becomes a product as well, and where products and feet, let's say, where a feet becomes identified, not necessarily as an organic living, breathing thing, but also as something that is bought and sold, something that is in exchange. So I was hinting at this in a certain way. I wanted it to operate in a number of different ways. I wanted it to be a sign of me, of my presence, of my vantage, of my point of view.
Of you as a witness of the city and the space.
Exactly, which was very much occurring in a certain way in the documentary photography of the public restrooms, for instance, that we were talking about previously. There's also a large degree of formal ambiguity that I wanted to insert into the work. That it has been. This was not a jump. This has been a trajectory over the 20 years, where I wanted to increasingly problematize what form meant. I felt it was a bit of an end game where I was before, of creating a practice that was extremely one-to-one, quite literal about sight. And I have slowly slipped. I might be returning now, though, I'm not sure. But I've slowly slipped towards something that also tries to politicize form even more directly.
Just in sake of time and going back, we have been talking about your work specifically, but I want to talk about how your text and your writing kind of like informs your production.
You know, so the book of writings, it includes not everything, but many things that I've written from 1991 to the present. There are many different forms that the writing takes. I think the earliest texts typically were very much connected to exhibitions and oftentimes part of exhibitions.
And this goes all the way back to your thesis, right? Where you had actually like sculptures juxtaposed with texts.
That's right. That's right. 42nd Street structures had the texts that went alongside them, were actually in the exhibition. They were later published in a journal as well. They have a couple of different lives. I was struck by something that Gordon, you said earlier about different states that your work has, and that it has one state where it is simply not simply, but it is the object in space, it is the sculptural moment, and then there's another moment of where it might have to do with performance, where your body or another body might enter the space, and that's another state. I think of my work as having different states this way, and the texts relate to that notion, where they are not the same thing, but they're iterations of each other. So they're when I was dealing with the idea of affect and dealing with the notion of persona, which was distinct from what I was doing in those earlier points, the writing also took on a different modality. I was very interested in voice as denaturalized. There are many different voices that occur in this book. I don't have one voice that I write from. I wanted it to be fragmented in many, so those became a more poetic verse. Now I find myself, like the culture at large, returning to a bit this moment that might be closer to the early 90s, where I want to be a little bit more ruthless and tough again, so and less poetic.
But also this strategy is often related to a method. And it has been said that this kind of like strategy that you use through the text and through the writing kind of like constitutes a curatorial approach to your own work.
You know, I thought, you know, I'm kind of, it's an interesting thing. I tend to form relationships very closely with curators that allow that for in an artist. It's a divide, but it has been. I've always been very much interested in the notion of accumulation within art practice. I don't know how y'all feel, but I'm never very interested in a particular object. In my house, in my life, in a store, in my practice. I'm interested in contingency. I'm interested in what accumulates and what things are, what the context is, and I don't mean this in some sort of highbrow theoretical way. I mean this is how I feel. This is how I relate to things in the world. They all have a story. They all connect to things, and they lead you somewhere else. And so with my work, the same. I'm less interested in any one thing that I've ever made. I don't get too hung up on whether it's a piece, a word I'm not too comfortable with, but whether a piece succeeds or fails. I'm interested in how it leads me to the next thing, or what it might mean retrospectively, perhaps.
And where exactly did you find out, or did you felt the need to gather all this material into a book?
Well, you know, it was actually an outside source. It was Florence Durieux, who was the co-editor of the book. It says editor. She's editor on the cover of the book, but I was also very much the editor. You know, I have to say, I think I'm quite facile at perhaps curating. Is this ringing for anybody else?
No.
No, just my own head. With my artworks, or the plastic work, the physical work, the three-dimensional work. With the writings, it was a daunting task for me to go back over them. I had to resist, although I didn't resist entirely at all, the desire to rewrite them. You know, it's just not a muscle that I had flexed and was comfortable with. But Florence in particular was the person who just really felt that this was very timely, that I gather these things together and create a volume out of it. And the book is quite large in format, and that was something that we have it right here. Quite attractive, I think. But I wanted it to, at first when I thought about this, was actually about 6 years ago, I thought that any important artist who has a book of texts, that it has to be a small book to be taken seriously, right? You know, one makes a large catalog raisonné, but a book of writing should be small to have any kind of gravitas to it. So we decided to do sort of the opposite thing and make the physicality of it more enunciated, and I wanted it to actually be like a script. You know, it's something that needs to be learned, something that is that one, and I don't mean that you need to learn what I've written, but I mean it in terms of it being self-consciously a proposal.
But it's funny that you say that, because I was actually going to ask you about it, because I think that, as you were saying previously, there are many mirrorings within your work, and kind of like how the text inform the works, and then I think the book actually has a very sculptural element, and it's kind of like going backwards to an art object.
I wanted it to be emphatically, almost trying to be one of my pieces, in a way. I mean, there's a wink to that, certainly, even in terms of, I mean, certainly the size, but also in terms of the materiality of the cover, the certain kind of black matteness. I mean, I find it kind of humorous, but I think there's a reality to it as well. I also thought, you know, I mean, when you see somebody reading your book on the subway, I just thought I'd much prefer to see it at this scale than, you know, a small thing like this. And, you know, like W Magazine or something, right? Or Interview. It also looks better in bookshops.
So we're running out of time,
Okay.
so I guess we'll open up for some questions to the public, if there's anyone. Pueden hacerlas en español y aquí se las traducimos al joven.
see now with this multi-diversity that we have apparently in our postmodern world, your own life and your own life as an artist, and what you propose yourself to do now, because I find yourself a critical being, politically a critical being. So what would you say now is the object of your work?
Okay. Well, you know, I've always felt, I don't think it's really changed. I've been quite consistent, I think, it's taken different forms, in trying to describe the coordinates that I find myself within. I've tried to, which I think, honestly, I think is for me, is one job that an artist can perform. There are many, I suppose. There are choices, of course. I have tended towards, I mean, it's quite an instinctual sort of thing that I have elaborated on intellectually, but to try to describe where I am. It's always been extremely important for me to not neutralize who I am and to lay bare the coordinates that I feel construct me. And I don't think that is as dry as it may sound. I mean it with, it's quite a passionate enterprise, I would say. I don't know if that answers your question. But I would say, is there a subject matter? No. I would say there is a view. There's a vantage that I'm continually trying to explore and trying to complicate. And I think one of the very few privileges, I would say, of having worked for a long time is the fact that your work can, I can make a piece now, or I can make a show now, or I can make a gesture now, and it becomes fuller because of things that I did 10 years ago, 20 years ago. The accumulative residual effect is something that I want to harness and use.
¿Alguna otra pregunta?
When Humberto asked you the question about your wish for a public, I thought about Andrea Fraser's essay on Sandbeck.
Yep.
The more we want to democratize, the more we get privileged. We become privileged and elitist and isolated from that public. And I just wanted, as a fellow artist, I'm curious about how you think about, process, advise others who are committed to the public but operate in very elitist and non-public settings.
Yeah, well, we can go back to Andrea on that in a way, I think, because I think one of the things that I mentioned this earlier, I think that I've always felt, and I think this is I think where we all have a bit of maybe some problems with the notion of quote-unquote public sculpture, because I think that there's an illusion that this is a more accessible notion or a more accessible space, when in fact it's very much a prescribed space as well. But I'm thinking very much about perhaps what Andrea said elsewhere, and that I think a lot of us at that time in the early 90s were thinking about and have taken with us that all of these institutions, if elitist structures, as you may call them, are there is no outside to that in a certain sense. If you're participating this way, we are the institution. I think would be the phrase that Andrea might use, and I think that acknowledging that and acknowledging that these structures have privileges and have exclusions is certainly the kind of enterprise that I think is worthy. Then that's part of this notion of acknowledging exactly where one stands, and that people stand in different places. That would be, I'm not sure that I'm exactly targeting what you were asking, but those are some of my thoughts on it.
Tenemos tiempo para una última pregunta. Bueno, pues thank you very much, Tom. It's an honor to have you here. Y todos los que quieran pueden pasar al booth de Bortolami, en donde Tom tiene 3 esculturas.
There's 3 pieces that are related to the Grips works, so please go by the booth.
Bueno, pues
Bring your
muchas
checkbooks.
Gracias.
Thank you very much for coming.